Hello, I'm Dr. Annalene Weston, dental legal consultant at Dental Protection. Welcome to RiskBites, a series of podcasts created specifically for dental practitioners in Australia. RiskBites looks at the key dental legal risks and issues affecting dental practitioners across Australia and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to steer clear of them, leaving you free to provide safe and high quality dental care for your patients. So today I'm talking with my colleague and fellow dental legal consultant, Dr. Simon Parsons, about common contract clauses that cause a little bit of consternation. So thanks for joining me today, Simon.
You're welcome, Annie. Nice to have a chat about this because it's such an interesting topic.
It is, absolutely. And by way of explanation, this time of year, many of our recent graduates are starting to move into the workforce, which is fantastic. And of course, we wish them all the best with their new adventure. And with that comes often a contract, and they ring us up for advice. I am going to start by prefacing this and saying it's really important, I think, Simon, and I suspect you agree, that if you have a contract, we really ought to get that reviewed by a contract lawyer. Do you agree with that?
I do. I mean, the only time that I'd say you may not need it is if it's one of those simple 1 or 2 page ones that just outlines what the pay rate or percentage is and how many weeks leave will be offered and doesn't really go into any great detail. Then I wonder how much a lawyer will add to that process. But for everything else, absolutely.
No, thank you, because it's such an important thing. And we get 2 types of calls about contracts. So at this time of year, we have a lot of recent graduates or candidates about to graduate who contact us because they want to know if their contract's okay. And then we get the calls throughout the year for people who are not happy in their workplace, and they find that they've signed a contract that's making it really difficult for them to either leave or to change the conditions in which they're working, which are making them unhappy because they've signed something that was quite unreasonable, or the clauses in the contract surrounding them leaving are not as they anticipated. So we wanted to spend some time talking through some of these common clauses, just in the hope that this provides a little bit of colour behind them and what to look out for. But please, 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 I cannot emphasise enough, this is such an important document. It's worth investing some time and money with a contract lawyer. Okie dokie. So Simon, I'm going to ask you the common questions that we get asked. Are you ready?
Absolutely. Let's fire away.
Okay. Simon, what's the difference between being an employee, being a contractor, and an SFA contract? And is there anything specific here that clinicians at each work arrangement need to be aware of?
Well, let's start with the employee one first, which is probably the least common that we see these days, because very few people in the dental industry other than our DAs seem to be employees. But if you are getting an employee contract, then in essence, a lot of the clauses that are in there, in fact, all the clauses in there will need to be compliant with what the Fair Work Act and the various other aspects of legislation prescribe. And so in that case, as an employee, you have minimum levels of rights that you are entitled to in conditions of work. And that would be things like having the equivalent of 4 weeks annual leave pro rata. Unless there's an enterprise agreement or some other arrangement, you may indeed actually have the right to annual leave loading, depending upon your role. You're going to be eligible to qualify for long service leave, which will be payable after 10 years if you take it, but it will be prorated from 5 years onwards if you were to be retrenched. So there's a number of different aspects to being an employee that, even if it's not specified in the piece of paper that you might sign, in reality you will have as entitlements, as conditions of your employment, because they're prescribed by law. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that employee contracts aren't necessarily as contentious, because if the contract requires something from you that doesn't comply with what the Fair Work Act would allow, then that won't be able to be enforced with you as the employee. And so I'm not so worried about employee contracts, because I think there's plenty of rights behind the scenes. And there's also a lot of advocacy, so that if you were to find, to pick up your theme earlier, Annie, that you're 6 months into a job where you're an employee and you realise it's not the right job for you, then there are provisions to allow you to leave. And it's not like they can enforce you to be there for 2 years. You would have a reasonable notice period and then you would be able to leave. So when in doubt, it's possibly actually quite a good thing to be an employee in one sense if we're talking purely about a contractual relationship, because there's a lot of rights that you would have that way.
Yeah, and they're protected at law from what you're saying. And I think that that's a really, really interesting point, is that if you're on an employee contract, then necessarily it has to comply with all the legislation. So those concerns about those potential unfairnesses, what, I was saying at the start, where people leave and they find that they're being held to something which they feel is unreasonable, that unreasonableness wouldn't necessarily exist because it would be within the confines of the law. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And I think you'd have really strong grounds to appeal any provisions that way if they was deemed to be unfair and unreasonable. When we move across to being a contractor, that's a totally different story. Most people end up being a contractor. That means that, in essence, you have signed a contract where you are running your own business in one way, shape or form on the premises of the owner of the practice. And in that case, that owner of the practice or their trust or other holding company can issue you with a contract that has a whole stack of different provisions in it and clauses that you need to comply with. Whether those clauses are reasonable or not is highly debatable. Most of the contracts that I think you and I see, Annie, skewed very much in favour of the practice.
Absolutely.
And to give you an example, I guess it might say that if the contractor wishes to terminate this agreement, they need to do so in writing, giving 3 months' notice. But then it will say if the practice wants to terminate this contract at any time, it can give the contractor 2 weeks' notice.
Yeah.
And we just see this. I don't know. It's just, in any other circumstance, you scratch your head and think, now, how can someone really think they're going to get away with this? But in reality, that's the nature of the beast here. Mm-hmm. So when you're a contractor, and if you're about to sign a contract, and some of these contracts can be 15, 20, 30 pages long, then you really need to read every line and ask yourself, is this consistent with what you understand the role would reasonably be? And I think the biggest difficulty for our new graduates and recent graduates is, with all due respect, most of them don't have enough experience in the dental industry to know what really is a reasonable norm. So they read the contract and they say, oh, well, I guess that sounds okay. It says that I may have to work on a Sunday and on public holidays, and I won't be paid any additional amounts for those days. And that will be at the practice's discretion, let's say. And they might say, well, that must just be what happens these days. Well, I would argue, no, that's not what happens these days. And I'd be advising anyone who rang us to say, I've got a contract with that clause in it, what do you think? I'd say, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to talk to you about the legal aspects of this, but the practical aspects are that I wouldn't sign something that gives carte blanche to the practice telling you when you need to work, when there isn't really a fixed schedule of the days that you're working, those sorts of things. I think that leaves you very vulnerable to being abused, in a sense, as someone working at the practice.
And not having a voice about, just suddenly being told you're working on a certain day when in fact that was a public holiday and that was not your intention. You also raised a really interesting point. One thing I've noticed, and I'm sure you've noticed this as well. So we are able to provide, I'm going to say limited contractual advice, because as Simon mentioned, we're not contract lawyers, but we will help you if there are clauses that you're not sure about. Have a look and say, yep, no, this is quite a standard clause, or no, I've never seen this before. And we can also get you in touch or put you in contact with lawyers who can assist you with this. And there are services that we offer as part of your dental protection membership. But separate to that, just as an observation, some of these contracts that we're getting sent through are huge. Like 35 pages. Have you noticed that?
I know. And some of our members say, oh, can you please just review this for me? And I have to say, look, I'll skim read a lot of it, but this is a couple of hours worth of work potentially to digest. And I worry. I guess I really worry in that, and maybe this is a old-fashioned sentimental view, so forgive me out there if you think so, but once upon a time when I first started in dentistry, I did have a contract, but most of the people I dealt with in the different roles that I were in had such good integrity and were so trustworthy that really the contract wasn't worth much to me, because the handshake that we had and the sort of conditions that they were providing me with were very sound. So there was no need to refer to the contract if there was a dispute, because in reality there wouldn't normally be a dispute.
No.
And they were very honest in how they paid you and everything else. So the contract I always see as your safety net. If you were a gymnast, or if you were, say, a tightrope walker in particular, and sometimes it feels like that in dentistry, unless you really feel confident that you can't possibly fall off, and I don't know why you would feel that way, the contract really is there so that when you can't agree on something, you go back to what was agreed from the outset, and that then defines how to resolve that dispute. And the difficulty with these 35-page contracts is sometimes one clause reads into the other, and it needs to be read in light of such and such earlier and then against the schedule at the end. And it's really quite legally complex. So I think it's so important, if you're getting a contract that's that long, if for any reason you don't understand everything in it, then again, I know it's about the third time we're saying it, but do get advice. If I can quickly just go into SFA one while I'm on a bit of a roll here. I think that's really an extension of that contractor arrangement, but it's really where, as part of that contract, it's really saying you are, in essence, employing or using, not so much employing in the strictest legal sense, but you are contracting with the practice to provide you with services. You're running your own practice on their premises. You're wearing all the liability for whatever comes from that practice of dentistry on those premises. And the difference I'm seeing in those SFA contracts primarily comes from the facility provider, the practice owner or corporate, trying to throw just about all the risk onto the individual dentist or hygienist or therapist or whatever it might be, and saying, well, you need public liability insurance because we won't accept any liability for any slips, trips or falls related to any patients that you see on our premises. You need to indemnify us against any claim later on for any damages that may arise from any treatment that you perform on our premises. And it's so broad that it's very difficult to understand why it needs to be so broad, but it really leaves you exposed. And I think, while I understand the nature of why some of these businesses, because they're being run very much like a business, want to protect their interest, it throws so much risk onto the individual. And again, it can have relatively skewed termination clauses. It can have, I don't know, I may be jumping the gun here, but it can have things like indemnity provisions that say that you are going to indemnify this practice even though you are actually hiring them to provide you with the service. So it sounds to me when I read these that you're indemnifying their DA's behaviour if the DA does something wrong, if the steri area screw up the infection control. And while we do have ethical and professional responsibilities in those areas with our support staff and we can't delegate those away, at the same time, it seems unreasonable because it's almost saying we're going to provide you with this service. We won't guarantee the quality of it half the time. And if it doesn't go right, well, you're going to wear the risk and you're going to be up for any costs of any rework that needs to come from it. So to cut a long story short, I find those are almost always really long and full of legalese. And they're also quite rigid in that I'm seeing a lot of these SFAs, particularly from corporates, where it's effectively like a form letter, except it's 30 pages long, and they're not really too keen on varying any clauses in there to suit the individual. It can be seen very much as a take it or leave it proposition. And that's something we can talk about later about what can we negotiate on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to go through some specific clauses now. And I think we'll start with indemnity provisions because we've already started that conversation. But before I do, I want to go back to what you mentioned about public liability. One thing that some of our members may not be aware of is that you are actually entitled to public liability cover as part of your policy through dental protection underwritten by MDA National. And it comes at no charge to you. So it's a free, for want of a better word, add-on you can get to your policy, but it is not automatic. If you need it, you're listening and thinking, oh, I need that public liability, all you have to do is ring up our membership team and they will activate that for you, okay? There are obviously provisions and underwriting provisions and all the usual stuff that goes with that. So, subject to your unique circumstances. I feel like a TV ad, subject to your unique circumstances. But generally, for your average person, it's just something that they have access to. And a lot of people don't realize and they think they need to go and buy it. If you're with us, you don't. It's there. It's available. You just need to tell us that you need it. So that's public liability. We'll just draw a line under that. Indemnity provisions. Now, to explain where this comes up as a clause, practitioners will ring up and they'll say, I'm not sure about clause 57B.2. And it will say something along the lines of, I will indemnify the practice in its entirety or something. What does that mean, Simon? What's reasonable, if anything?
Okay. I think what they mean in that clause is that you, as the contractor, typically, are going to cover any financial or legal risk that the practice incurs as a result of you practicing on their premises, and you are going to cover potentially any loss that they may incur, including loss of goodwill, loss of reputational status. And those are really hard to quantify. So I see this as a really broad brush grab at people. And what I really struggle with here is that when you have insurance through Dental Protection MDA National, or if you were to have it through any of our competitors, to the best of my knowledge, none of the professional indemnity policies cover a practice unless you have ownership of that practice. And if you have ownership of the practice, it will only cover the practice to the extent that you have that ownership. So if you're 50% owner, in our case, your policy may very well, depending upon the circumstances, cover 50% of the risk of the practice if they're deemed one and the same by the insurer in terms of the claim. That's in one of the early clauses in the MDA policy. But none of these indemnity policies, as I was saying, cover a third party, in which case it's the practice, for any loss that they incur. And so if you sign a contract that says you're going to cover the risk of the practice and those losses, I'm sorry to say it, but we won't be able to help you with that. No. And sometimes there are provisions here for $20 million of cover. And if you sign that up to that limit, then you're really leaving yourself incredibly exposed. So I think it's just a nice little grab because, again, the practice is trying to say we won't bother with insurance for these sorts of things. We'll just throw it all at the contractors who work here for us and hope that one of their policies can respond. But where it becomes really contentious is if there was to be, let's say someone, and we've dealt with this particular case, someone is having dental treatment done in the chair, there's supine, they're sat up at the end of the appointment, and then they keel over and fall out of the chair and hit their head on the floor.
Which happens, and we have had that happen. Exactly.
And now the question is, all right, where does the liability rest here? Now, obviously, the primary liability, I would normally argue, will lie with the dentist treating that patient.
Just to take a moment, I actually had this question the other day in a webinar. Somebody said, what's liability? So liability, another way of looking at it in the circumstances we're talking about, is who's responsible for paying for this. That's a way. So when we're talking about liability in this, when we're saying whose liability is it, who pays? Who pays any costs that patient may incur as a consequence of that fall? It just occurred to me, Simon, that we use these words and we they might mean different things to outside of a dental legal context to what they mean to us. So I just thought I'd take that moment. So, okay. So as you were saying, the practitioner, sorry,
Yeah.
please carry on.
No, thanks. I mean, it's an important point. I mean, who is ultimately accountable here? And I guess that's what you're saying. And in nearly every case, you're going to find it's the treating practitioner, of course, because that patient is a patient of yours, even though your contract says that the patients belong to the practice, but they're still your patient. And if this was ever to go to court, I would think that the court will find that the practitioner is primarily responsible. I would think if this ever went in front of APRA, you're going to find they're going to just look at the registry, that's you, and they're going to say, what happened to this patient? How come they ended up with in hospital with a brain injury? And we want to understand how this occurred and whether you did things properly or not. So we have those sorts of incidents, and you'll find that as a contractor, the practice will just dump all the liability on you. But sometimes that fall might not happen just by your chair. It might happen when they're out at reception.
Yeah.
It might happen when they go to the toilet afterwards because they've been holding on for an hour. And they get a massive drop in blood pressure or whatever, and boom, they faint. And the next thing you know, the ambulance is being called, and we get these every month at least where we get asked the question, okay, we had to call the ambulance. The patient doesn't want to pay. Do we have to pay for this? So sometimes the contracts are really helpful if they spell out who's going to be responsible for this. But I guess I'm saying if it happens when the patient is in the toilet, they're still your patient. Perhaps on a legal basis you will be responsible. But in the first instance, they were outside of your direct care. They could have fainted even before you get to see them.
And we have that. Fainted and smacked their face on the reception desk. Do you remember that one? That was reasonably recent. Patient walked in and collapsed and banged their face on the reception desk as they went down and gave themselves quite a bang, actually.
Yeah.
And poor thing. And in a situation like that, the first thing we need to do, of course, is be caring about the patient, not worrying about what the contract says. But that's a story for another day.
But if the practice says, Annie, you need to get your insurance to pay for this, I imagine you might think, but hold on a sec, this is a new patient. I've never even seen them before.
That's right.
I haven't taken a medical history. I haven't given them any local anaesthetic. They haven't even sat in my chair yet.
Yeah.
Am I liable? And the problem is that when it's a grey area like that, the practices tend to try to enforce the clauses in the contract. And if they're there, it gives them more scope to pursue you. Whereas if they weren't there, if they were more reasonable, we might be able to assist you differently in a situation like that.
Yeah, no, that's a really fair explanation. Thank you. Now, another clause that causes quite a lot of upset are restraint clauses. Now, I'm going to start this by saying, so a restraint clause will be for a certain period of time, say 6 months, you can't work after you leave within a certain distance. Now, to be clear, I once had a contract where the restraint clause was 200 kilometers for the period of 12 months. And I'm going to get back to that because I'm essentially, I know what Simon's going to say, because I know what Simon's going to say about this because it's standard advice. And then I'll loop back to why. So restraint clauses, are they fair? And what do they need to be if they are?
They can be fair. And I think if you were the owner of a practice and you've had someone working at the practice as a contractor for a significant period, that contractor will have developed some goodwill for the practice, will have a loyal patient following. And if that person sets up next door and takes those patients with them, then suddenly, if it's a 2 or 3 person practice, they're diluting your turnover by 33% or 50%, all other things being equal. So I think from the practice owner's perspective, a restraint clause in most instances is fair. The question is what it says as to how fair it is. So if it says, and a lot of the time we see a 5 kilometre radius in an urban area, and I say, well, look, that doesn't sound too bad for most of the time. But then I've dealt with members who live, say, live and work in Townsville or somewhere, say in Queensland or Gladstone, and beautiful parts of the world, But in reality, the busy areas of those provincial or regional towns probably extend for 5 or 10 kilometre radius from the central part of town. So when we see a clause like that, it basically excludes you from working at all in Gladstone in any meaningful way. Now, could you set up in a suburb or a little hamlet somewhere outside of there? Well, of course you could then. But it may mean otherwise that you have to consider working somewhere totally separate at the next big regional centre, which could be 50 or 100 kilometres away.
Agreed.
So that's when I say I understand why it's there. I understand that it could be fair for the practice in one sense, but if there's 10 other dental practices in the area and you went to work for as a contractor for one of them 3 or 4 kilometres away, I don't know how much difference that would make to the viability of the practice you've just been working at. So I do worry when I see these, say, 10-kilometre radius, because I say to the members, did you do any maths in high school? And they say yes, because of course you have to. And they say, so what's pi r squared, which is the area of that restraint area? And, so that's 3.1415926535, and they go on, times the radius squared. So, you're talking, if it's 5-kilometre radius, it's over 75 square kilometre area that you can't work in. If it's 10-kilometre radius, it's like 300 k's. That's square kilometres. That's a big area. And the other thing is, it might not be easy where I live in Sydney, depending on the time of day, to travel 10 kilometres could take you an hour.
That's right.
So, it's got all practical issues as well as professional issues here.
Yeah, and you could have families settled in schools or daycares and things like that. So I think with restraint clauses, they're understandable why they exist. They're essentially to stop you from setting up a practice next door and taking 50% of the patients. That's what they're there for. It's what the practice is trying to protect. But there needs to be a reasonableness to it. So to be clear about my 200-kilometre restraint clause, the nearest I was working in regional Queensland, and the nearest regional centre to us was 202 kilometres away. So what the principal was essentially saying is, you can go and work in the next big settlement, but what you can't do is set up a practice midway between me and them, because you're going to take half my patients. That's essentially what they were trying to safeguard themselves against. Now, what becomes interesting then is whether or not it's enforceable. Because if I lived 50% between the two centres and in a small town, and I had children, as I said, settled in schools and daycares and set up my practice, and that practitioner challenged me, then somebody would have to make a decision. Somebody legal would have to make a decision regarding the reasonableness of that clause. So I think you need to have a look and say, where am I? If you're working in urban central Sydney and they've got 200 kilometres, I think we would all agree that's not reasonable. And sometimes 2 kilometres, as you've said, is not reasonable. Yeah. So it has to be reasonable and it has to be fair. Now, we're going to get to negotiations shortly, because I do think that it's important to remember that a contract ought to be negotiable at the start. Once you've signed it, it's a bit late. Another thing that causes a bit of distress are managing reworks after you've left the practice. So to explain what I mean by that, if I place a restoration and it falls out, and the patient comes in, I would just pop that restoration back in at no charge. It's my feeling something went wrong, probably in the bonding process, or I've misjudged something and I need to fix that up at no charge to the patient. That's fair. So if I place a filling and then I leave and the patient comes in a week after I've left, the idea is the practice keeps a percentage of probably my last paycheck. Sometimes they keep a percentage of each paycheck. It can be different. And they keep it for a set period of time for those types of circumstances. That is the overarching concept of reworks. Now, of course, that's not necessarily how the money gets used. And if you're going to leave an amount for reworks, which I have to be honest, I think in itself isn't an unreasonable concept. Again, it needs to be an appropriate amount for an appropriate period of time. If you've been at that practice for 20 years, theoretically, you might have more failures. I don't know, maybe you'll have fewer. If you've only been at the practice for a week, how many failures can you have? That's not a challenge. So managing reworks, what clauses need to be in effect? And I think just it would be really helpful at this moment as well to give a little bit of advice to our colleagues on how to deal with that when you leave a practice with the practice itself.
In terms of reworks, I think any clauses should really outline or be consistent with what our general views on professional responsibility would be, which are that where something fails, you would be given the option of being involved in what we call the remediation of that problem. And by that, another technical term, it's to make good a situation. So using your example, Annie, if a filling falls out and needs to be replaced, then I think it's very reasonable for a practice, ideally in this situation, to have a clause there that says for any rework up to the value of $300, we will proceed with that and let you know about it as soon as possible, when there's a sense of time is of the essence again. Because to say the patient's in the chair, that restoration has fallen out. Ideally, the practice would call you and say, look, Mrs. Jones is in and 35DO has fallen out. Can we just fix this free of charge and we'll bill you for it out of those funds? But the practicality of that is very limited. So, I think that sort of clause, if it was there, would be actually quite constructive. But when it's so broad, which is what we tend to see, it says that all and any reworks will remain the absolute responsibility of the contractor, and this will survive beyond the term of the contract for a minimum period of 7 years, then I'm going to say that may or may not be reasonable, because although in some situations your work may really have an expectation of a warranty beyond 7 years, a simple DO restoration may not. And so when you have these sorts of provisions in there, it again makes things really murky. So if you're going to have a rework clause in a contract, it really just needs to say what a rework is, when this clause might effectively apply, what the communication is going to be around that, what the value of the reworks may be limited to without any prior consultation, and ideally give you as the contractor involvement in the decisions that may proceed with that patient within reason. So, and the reason why I say this is we've had patients who chip a crown and the crown's 6 months old, the practitioner's left the practice, and the practice decides they want to change that crown to a crown of a different material, but because the patient's complained of the shade of that crown, they want the tooth next door also crowned because they've also been getting a bit of food impaction. And so now they're going to try to claim for 2 crowns from the practitioner who's left. And I don't see that as reasonable. So I think like for like is reasonable. This open-ended, anything that's required to fix the problem up for the patient needs to be covered by the contractor type of clause, I don't think is reasonable.
Agreed.
Yeah. Did I answer all of those questions?
No, you did. No. From my own experience, the same practice with the 200-kilometre clause, they held a chunk of money for 6 months after I left. And then by agreement, and I think that they were very fair people. I know it doesn't sound fair when you start, some of the stuff I say, like 200 kilometers sounds wild, but they were not unfair people. And so when we got to 6 months, I got a spreadsheet with any reworks that needed to be done. And then I could request the records of any patients because there was like a line descriptor of what it was. And there was one that caught my eye. I asked for a copy of the records, and needless to say, the rework money did not come from me, and the patient did have to pay for this. Because you've got to bear in mind, sometimes it's easier to do it for free than it is to charge the patient, particularly certain patients. So this particular patient of mine was a mixed martial arts cage fighter. I'm not even joking. And so on the weekends, he would fly to Asia. He had like a day job in the mines, and he would fly to Asia and go and do some cage fighting. And he didn't want to wear a mouth guard because, made him look soft. And so he'd break his front teeth all the time for reasons which should be apparent. And so I'd repaired his anterior restorations and provided him with a mouth guard and advised him that I didn't really care if it made him look soft. I wasn't doing them for free if he got them punched out. Put your mouth guard in. And he turned up at the practice bloodied and bruised. Hello, I'm a cage fighter. These fillings got knocked out, and I don't think I should have to pay for these. And the young practitioner who took over from me said, of course not, sir. In fact, I should probably pay you for the privilege of treating you. And so they charged to push that payment onto me. That's not reasonable or fair. My records reflected very clearly the circumstances in which those restorations had been placed, or should I say replaced, the advice that had been given, and the fact that that work was not warranted if he didn't wear his mouthguard. And the records reflected, cage fight in Thailand, did not wear mouthguard. Like, it was all there. So anyway, to be young again, those were the wild days, weren't they? Yes. So another one that causes some distress are leave provisions. So is it reasonable to have a leave provision in your contract? What's reasonable? And also, is it okay for contracts to have your start and finish times in there, do you think? Do you think that's fair?
Generally, yes. I think that there are operational needs of a business. And I think if they're not specified, then it becomes carte blanche, and the problem is everyone thinks something different. So if we're talking first about leave, I think it's helpful for a practice to be able to resource a surgery and know how many weeks in a year you're likely to work there. I think there needs to be some flexibility here. I think any leave provision should at least be equivalent to what you'd be entitled to in a statutory sense as an employee. And I say that, so if it's an employee contract, it will or should. And if it doesn't, you can try to enforce it. If you're a contractor, I don't know many people who say, I only really want to take 2 weeks annual leave every year and I want to forfeit all my public holidays. So I think contracts need to say, let's say the contractor agrees to work at the practice a minimum of 46 weeks in a year, let's say. That gives you scope to have up to 6 weeks off in any year. But when we're talking about leave, there needs to be some rules around planned leave, which is all of that. I need next month, the afternoon off on a Wednesday to go to my child's prize presentation at the end of the year, let's say. That sort of thing is reasonable when you give adequate notice, and that would count out of your planned leave. And then there would be some unplanned leave when you're sick, and everyone gets sick from time to time. So I've seen contracts that don't allow for unplanned leave, or that there's penalties that you pay a service fee for the room, even though you're not going to be working there because you've taken unplanned leave. I see that as unconscionable and quite unfair that way.
Me too. It's upsetting. If you have a family emergency, like an unwell family member, you need to be by their side, and then you're being charged for that. That doesn't feel fair. No,
it doesn't. And I think people also need scope to better go to conferences and do professional development. And some of that should really be driven by the practice, and good practices will take their employees and their contractors with them to major conferences sometimes, so they all get equivalent knowledge in a particular area and may be consistent with the positioning of the practice, in which case that would be great. But a lot of practices want to try to, again, penalise people for wanting to go to a conference, and there's all sorts of rules and regulations, in a sense, around whether they can or can't. So I think wherever we're talking about leave provisions, yes, have them written into the contract provided they're reasonable. Have start and finish times spelt out, but have a reasonability clause around there, because I've seen clauses where it says the contractor agrees to be in attendance no later than 30 minutes after the agreed start time and leave no earlier than 30 minutes prior to the end time on any particular work day. But Annie, you and I know that there are days when your last patient, who was a bridge prep, has cancelled, and it's 2.5 hours, and you're free from 2:30 instead of finishing at 5 that day. Now, how reasonable is it to expect you to stay at the practice till 4:31 before you go home? I think it is if you get lots of walk-ins and it's a really busy practice. It isn't if it's a start-up sort of practice and there's only 3 patients booked in that day anyway. And why would you come in at 8:30 every day when the receptionist is booking the first patient in at 10:30? That is ridiculous. So you don't want to be left in a situation where you're going to wear penalties for that. So yeah, have start and finish times, but have it so that there's some give. I think a good practice won't enforce that. They'll say, oh, look, we'll bunch up all your patients and we'll let you leave early. But as a contractor, they've only got limited control over what you can and can't do. You're meant to be independent. You're meant to be able to specify your availability. So that's where the negotiation comes in. If you think that you don't want to work Saturdays or Sundays or public holidays and you don't want to finish later than 2 p.m. on a Friday, then negotiate that into a contract. I worked with someone once who for religious reasons had to finish on a Friday before sundown.
Yes, absolutely.
And so that was written into their contract and that was perfectly fine. Everyone understood it and the appointment books were set up to reflect that. And we want to be inclusive in that sense and we need to be, ethically and morally. We need to respect people in those situations. So, but if it's not in the contract and that's something that resonates with you out there, then get it put in.
Absolutely. No, I agree. I always find it ironic you mentioned startup practices. And I think it's important when you are building a business, you do need to be there in case a patient comes in. Okay. So if you're the business owner and you're building your business, you know yourself, sometimes you just got to sit there and it's gappy. But I find it quite ironic, particularly with some of the recent graduates, that they compel them to be there, but concurrently, they won't pay the DA to be there. So the dentist is sat there by themselves. So if a patient walks in, how are they expecting that dentist to treat that patient by themselves? Well, again, what's fair? That doesn't sound very fair to me.
No. And we all understand the pressures on practices in terms of cost, but it has to be workable. And we can't compromise patient care simply to save money that way. And it sets a really bad tone for someone's start to their career if half the time, the first patient of the day they're trying to manage without a DA, they're actually setting up the room themselves.
Yes.
And they're doing all sorts of things that you think, you know what, I didn't do all these years at university to have to do this spade work. And maybe that sounds a bit arrogant and proud. I hope it doesn't, but you shouldn't have to do that.
No, you shouldn't be doing
we all help our DAs out when we've been practicing for a long time. And obviously we manage our sharps and we specify what we're going to need. And if there's a huge cleanup, we can sometimes help when there's lots of time available to do that. But the primary responsibility is for us to focus on our patients, and our support staff help us do that. And if we don't have the support staff to do that, we can't treat people to a standard that would be acceptable a lot of the time. Or we're putting ourselves at enormous risk.
Yeah, we can't treat the patients safely or have our own safety. Now, you've used one of my favourite words, and I've used that as well, because culturally, of course, I think everything's negotiable. So what's negotiable in a contract? Do you think it's fair? I know what I think. I'm curious to know what you think. Do you think it's fair if you get one of these contracts and there's some stuff that you don't like? Like, for example, for the reason that you discussed, your colleague who had to not be working after the sun had set on a Friday, or let's just say I've actually had this with a contract where the contract said I started work at 8, but I had a preppy. And those of you who have children in prep will know that you have to go in and sit in the classroom with them until school starts at whatever time. And that's not 8 o'clock. Okay. So there's no way I could reasonably have made that start time. So do you think it's fair to negotiate that as somebody coming into a practice?
Yes, I think in fact, it has to be negotiated in one way, shape or form, because I see a contract as, if I was to use a different term, it's meant to be an agreement. Okay, so there needs to be agreement on how things can work. We do all sorts of things in life where things just sort of fall out and fall into place and somehow they work. But when we're talking about people with family responsibilities, or even financial responsibilities, I deal with members who say, I was promised to have 3 days a week at the practice, and now they've cut my days back to 1. Yeah. And the contract, I say, what does your contract say? And it says, doesn't say anything. Or it says, the number of days worked by the contractor will be at the practice's discretion. And you go, okay.
How
So
wonderful for the practice.
yeah, but how do you pay your mortgage, or how do you
Hmm.
support your elderly parents if that's your role? So, and you're relying on that as your primary source of income. So we need to have anything contentious worked through, or if we can't agree on it, just don't include it. And in that case, it's removed from the contract and it's dealt with on an ad hoc basis. And while that leaves a certain level of risk, I would argue it also leaves a lot of flexibility, because then it might be to say, practice say, look, Annie, I understand you've got to, you'll only be in at 9:30 on Tuesday next week, but can we ask you to stay late on the Wednesday?
Hmm.
Just to make up for the patients that we're now going to have to move. And I
Hmm.
think if that was the conversation, now me knowing you the way I do, you wouldn't be unreasonable because you're very dedicated to your patients. So if there are patients who needed to be seen next week, but you were going to be starting late, you'd make up the time somewhere else. It was
Of
just,
course.
that's just what we do. We're
Hmm.
professionals at the end of the day. Um, does that need to be written in a contract? I don't really think so.
Hmm.
When you're dealing with people who take their professional responsibilities seriously. But, I sorry to wax on about this, but I dealt with a recent graduate not so long ago who said the practice is having a go at him because he runs late and it throws out his whole day. And so I said to him, well, what time do you turn up at the practice? Well, I'm meant to start at 8 o'clock on this day and this day and this day. Sometimes I've been turning up 5 or 10 minutes late and then I'm running behind. So I sort of said to him, well, mate, what does that tell you about your professionalism? What does it look like when your patient's been there since 10 to 8 and you're turning up at 10 past and then you run late and then it snowballs throughout the day? Do you think it's fair that the practice is upset with you? And he said, well, he didn't really get it. And I said, it's the unseen things that we do, in a sense, that define how professional we are. And so when your patient's there at 8, they expect you to already be set up and have read their file and know what you're doing to them when you call them in at 8 o'clock, not 8:05, not 8:10. I labour the point because those sorts of things don't really need to be in a contract. We don't need penalties to say you need to start on time. It's just one of those givens. So I think we need to negotiate on the things that aren't understood, but sometimes as a new graduate, you might not really know what is understood and what isn't understood in a sense. So maybe you need more detail so that it's at least spelt out so that you know where you stand and what's expected of you professionally. And I think that's okay to be in a contract. But if you're someone with 20 or 30 years experience, like many of us, it's rubbish because we'd be doing that already. So why have
Yeah.
it in there?
No, for sure.
Yeah. So, yeah, simple answer after all of that is negotiate anything that you don't like, add in anything that should be in there that isn't there, and do that before you have any patients booked in, before you have committed to a practice. And it's too late to try to negotiate it 6 months or a year in, unless the contract has a clause in it, which you negotiated originally, which said that we agreed to review this contract at least annually and are amenable to changing any provisions that haven't proved workable in the previous 12 months. And if that was in there, you might be able to quite happily make those changes.
Yeah, for sure. I think as well, when you're going in before you sign the contract, if there are clauses that aren't tenable for you. And I really liked your example of the colleague on the Friday, because I think that that's not something that's negotiable for that person. That's part of their system, their belief system that they have to do. It's not an opt-in for them. Okay. If the practice is not willing to consider that or negotiate, then I would suggest that not only should you not be signing that contract, but it's probably not a safe workplace for you because you're not culturally safe there. If you've got young children and the practice is saying under no circumstances can you ever take time off to go and watch sports day, swimming carnival, school awards, we'll never let you move your lunch break, we'll never let you accommodate that, we'll never let you pick your child up sick, well, I think I'm going to say that working environment's not going to be tenable for you, and find a different job. Sorry, and to be so candid.
Absolutely. And we've talked about this a lot, I know, where, the gist of this is, hey, if you're having lots of sticking points, just negotiating the simplest things in the contract before you start, what's it going to be like when you say, I want composite in shades other than A2 and A3? Like if they're so sticky about these other things, how are you going to get a good DA? How are you going to negotiate those infection control issues that are just problematic in the practice that you only realise once you start there? Because these guys are so inflexible in terms of the contract, it's just going to be an uphill battle the rest of your career there.
Absolutely.
Don't go there.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So I would say with that as well, a lot of practices are fantastic at onboarding people, but when things break down, that's when your contract can become critical. And that's where having some provisions around how you leave and understanding those provisions around how you leave are really, really important, because leaving somewhere with a bad taste in your mouth, and everyone's unhappy, that just doesn't help. Now, Simon, one last question, really. I've started to notice some trends coming through in the last couple of weeks, which was actually what prompted us in many ways to have this podcast discussion. Have you noticed any new trends in contracts recently? For example, some lower commissions. We talked about the liability to pay the facility fee, and we've seen some things about extra sessions. So can you run through some of those for me?
Yeah, there's been a few. Let's pick up one that we sort of touched on a bit earlier, which was payment of a facility fee on a daily or sessional basis, irrespective of whether there's patients booked in. I think that's something where you don't want to be on the hook for the first $500 or $1,000 that's billed in any one day. That automatically goes to the practice. It's like paying them a retainer. Ideally, it would be the other way around. They pay you the retainer just for showing up, and it's up to them to get some patients booked in there. So when you're paying the practice a retainer, when you have no guarantee that there's any business, you're pretty mad if you agree to that. It's unfair. And you can't afford to do that unless you've got very rich parents and you've been bankrolled through uni. And that's not most of our experiences, I don't think. So we really need to watch out for those. Same with either a starting commission. I've seen some apparently very affluent high-end practices paying new graduate dentists who start their commissions as low as, say, 20%.
Yeah, we're starting to see that, aren't we? 20-25%. And I understand that practice costs have gone up and that the associates have been being paid the same percentage since the 80s. But also practice income has gone up too. We're charging more than we were charging in 1982, one would hope.
Yes, but 20% of some bulk bill treatment through a preferred provider arrangement that, or a practice promotion. This is where it becomes sticky. I'm sorry, you got me on my high horse here, but
no, it's a cup of coffee, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's what you're getting paid, a cup of coffee.
If it's a $99 checkup and clean, and you get 20% of that, that is $20 for half an hour, 40 minutes work. You're going to pay tax on that. It might be more than a cup of coffee on a good day, but it's only a sandwich. Otherwise, it's not much, and you're not going to have a sustainable livelihood that way, and it's going to leave a really bad taste in your mouth, and you're going to look at your patients as someone who needs to be churned through quickly and it becomes like the national health in a sense. It's volume, fast-moving consumer good type stuff, which isn't what dentistry should be about in my book. I think there's the liability provisions where they're very skewed. We're seeing a lot of those coming in. We're seeing a lot of high cost items being added into the contract. So it's fair that if you are, say, doing a tooth whitening on a patient, that the practice may bill you for the whitening kit, because that is often a considerable cost if it's in-chair whitening. It's fair if they charge you for in-house made mouth guards or retainers, because there's a certain amount of labour involved with that. I don't know how fair it is if you make those mouth guards yourself. You should really just be paying for the blank, or if it comes as part of a Zoom kit like what we have, then you're paying for it if the cost of the kit's being deducted. So why would you be paying for it twice? Yeah, I digress. I guess the thing is, we're seeing now where, even the simple things that you might use in practice are trying to be gouged for. No, I'm not talking about cotton rolls, thankfully. Yet, but it could be rotary endophiles. It could be a lot of componentry that's being used just for everyday things. It could be impression materials where they're, rubber-based sorts of things. So I have real concerns that if you sign contracts with those provisions, you're just being led up the garden path and you're going to really regret it. And I'm also seeing, though, I make this my final point, it's like a minimum term of a contract. And
yes,
and it's 2 years or it's 3 years and there's no cooling off period written in there. And I've got one member at the moment who signed, I think it was from memory, a 3-year contract, was promised a lot of mentoring and professional development, and was told that while it was a startup practice, they'd have to build the practice, which is often the case, that it was likely to be really busy. And of course, it hasn't been busy. They've had no mentoring whatsoever. And 6 weeks or 2 months into the deal, they're sitting around thinking, why am I here? I want out. And they've gone and said, I want to resign. And they've been told, well, no, you can't do that. If you resign, you're going to owe us hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages.
Yeah.
The contract says you need to work for 3 years. So I'm seeing that, and it really gives me cause for concern.
Yeah, makes me anxious. So, Simon, should we bother with a contract then as a recent graduate? Shall I just not have one? What do you think?
No, you need a contract.
Oh, okay.
It'd be nice, wouldn't it? It'd be like if you own a Tesla and you have full self-driving, do I really need to leave my hands on the wheel? And the answer is, well, legally you do, but practically you're still responsible. And so you just can't delegate all of that risk away and say, well, we don't need anything in writing because, hey, we did shake on it. Now, I have started jobs, and this is where someone's going to call me a hypocrite. I have agreed to start a job without a contract on at least one occasion.
Me too.
And it worked out fine. And the main reason why I did that was the person offering me the job I'd known for many years, the industry. He's the most honourable sort of guy. And, as far as I was concerned, if he said something, it was 100% true. So, and it always proved to be the case. So I had no need for a contract. We still had a contract drawn up. But that was really just to, due diligence to make sure there's something there when the bean counters look at these things. But it was never needed in essence. But as a new graduate, of course you need it. You don't know who's hiring you. The exception here would be if you work for your mum or your dad who's a dentist, and you're stepping into the practice, then, hey, if you want to have a contract, have it drawn up, but, this is going to be a bit like arguing over a will later. Families can get really nasty, but even I see the will as it's not a contract, but it is a legal document. And when people can argue over wills within a family, hey, you can have a contract, but you're going to argue over that too. So I'd like to think you avoid some of that angst if you can. Yeah.
And often mum isn't going to want you working Christmas Day and put you in the practice on Christmas Day because she's going to want you at home.
That's right.
So I think, just to conclude, Simon, from what I'm taking away from our conversation, contracts are helpful, not just because both parties understand what's required, but also they help you leave, and they help you leave well. Would you agree?
Yes.
Get your contract checked. I think we've said that many
times. Absolutely.
Consider the reasonableness of what you're being asked to do. And if you're not sure, about the reasonableness, but also what the clause means, ask. I wouldn't be going into a conversation with a new employer saying, I think you're being entirely unreasonable, because I don't think that's the way to start a conversation with someone. But I think it's okay to say, I don't understand. What does this mean? And if there are things which you need in the contract or you need removing for whatever reason, and the person that you're talking to is not willing to consider that, and they're being very inflexible about something that's important to you personally or whatever, whether that be family, whether that be for religious reasons, and they're not willing to consider that, then that probably isn't going to be a safe and healthy workplace for you. Anything else?
Right. And don't be pressured into signing on the day.
No.
Like everything else, we'll hold this job only for 24 hours. You need to sign this, otherwise we're going to offer it to the next candidate. Well, hey,
so be it.
Yeah, again, what does that tell you about their ethics? If they really want you, they'll work in with you. They will negotiate most of the things that you want. But can I just say the final thing? There's always going to be compromise, I think, in
It's
life.
just life,
We know
isn't it?
that. So you can get this back and it will say that there's 20 things that need to be changed. Sometimes you can't change all 20.
Yeah.
That's the reality. And you need to know what your next best acceptable option is. It may be that out of those 20, there are 5 things that, you have to have sorted, otherwise you can't work there. That may be some of the indemnity stuff and things that otherwise leave you, totally exposed. There'll be other things where you might just have to concede those things because you actually gain something extra somewhere else. So don't go so much for the jugular, but anything that you don't like, try to have changed and have a minimum point in mind as to where you just draw the line and say, hey, if I can't at least get these, I'll concede that one, but the other 18 or 19 I need sorted, And I think if you can look at it that way, you won't end up being a prima donna. You will have hopefully a very workable contract, and you'll hope that that one little clause doesn't come back and bite you. Most of the time it won't. But if you're not sure, don't sign. But don't come, I don't mean this in a bad sense, but, it's really difficult to help someone when they've signed a contract and gotten themselves in a hole. And yes, we can organise for them to get legal advice, ultimately at the member's expense. But, the damage is done a lot of the time. So just don't go there. Trust your instincts. I say this a lot in a lot of other things I talk about, but if it doesn't smell right and look right, well, it probably isn't.
Probably isn't. No, that's for sure. No, thanks, Simon. That's so helpful. And thank you all for listening. Simon and I truly, truly, truly hope that it's going to help some of our recent graduates listening, and maybe some others too, just get in their head what they need to be looking for with a contract so that they can have a safer and happier practicing life. So we hope that this was helpful, and we look forward to sharing more guidance with you in the future. If you like Dental Protection Podcasts and you'd like to hear more, please subscribe and leave a review.